Well, g'day folks, how are you? Sorry I'm a bit late. I've been on the road from Oxford to here. And so when you next see the British Transport Secretary, have a word about the state of the British road system. Let me have an idea of where you're all from. How many Brits in the room? Good. Americans? Hi. You're a persecuted minority, aren't you? The Australians? Okay, you can tell those folks here. They'll be buying the free drinks later. The Canadians? Yeah. Another oppressed minority. The Kiwis? Hi, I'm Shaky. Good to see you. The Europe? Hey, stacks of people from Europe. That's good. France? La Belle France? Deutschland? Okay, good to see you all. Other parts of Europe. The China. 中国来的朋友们，大家好。对，都是北京来的吗？上海吗？还有别的地方呢？香港。天津、北京、上海、深圳，还有吗？广州，南方，还有别的地方吗？啊？山东吗？哦，成都在西边那个成都嘛。啊，那好。还有吗？唐山。在哪儿？湖南。是吗？欢迎。说湖南是毛主席的老家，对不对？ India. I don't speak a word of Hindi, I'm sorry. I just generally hopeless. It's good to see so many folks here from India. Latin America. Hey, good to see you. Where are you from, sir? Colombia. In Bogota? Yeah, it's a beautiful part of the world. Africa. Where are you from?
South Africa.
Okay. Whereabouts? Where in South Africa? Joburg. Good. Where have I missed? Anyone not included in the above? Yeah.
Singapore.
Well done. Okay. Okay. Host of the about to be, maybe going to be convened summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un on the future of nuclear weapons. So depending on the mood levels between the two of them in the next 2 weeks. Now, I've got a prepared text here. Do you want me to read that or do you want me just to talk to you? Okay. So this will go up on your website. It's a very, do you have a website I can put it up on? Oh, well done. It's worth having a look at. It's The Rise of China, the Future of the G20, and the Adequacy of the Global Financial Safety Net, 10 years on from the Washington Summit of December 2008. So it's there. So why don't I, where's the clock? There isn't one. What is it about university lecture theatres in the United Kingdom? You never have a clock. You expect folks up the front just to kind of know automatically what the time is. I'm told we've got to get out of here at 6:45, is that right? Okay, so let me put this thing on. And so I'm going to talk for the next 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. The G20. Let's talk about why it came into being, what it's done in the last decade or so, and on top of that, where it needs to go in the future. Let's also talk about China's role in the G20. And let's talk about, are we ready for the next financial crisis, wherever it might occur, whichever country it might occur in, and have we learnt the lessons of the last one? The G20. In the events of 2008, when the global financial crisis erupted, basically the world wasn't ready for it. The warning signs had been there for a while. We had subprime crises emerging in US mortgage markets, basically from the end of 2007 on. But things did not reach crunch point until we were in the first and second quarters of 2008. And then we had the Lehman crisis of September 2008. And that's when a proverbial substance hit the fan. Okay, that's a poetic expression from Australian English. And the rapidity with which one private financial institution after another fell over turned what began as a crisis in a derivatives market in the US residential sector to become a general crisis across the financial sector in the United States, which then became a crisis of all leading private financial institutions in the world. And really, the contagion effect was in a matter of weeks. And so suddenly, those of us who were in office at the time were faced with a series of existential challenges. One, how did you protect average savers' deposits in banks if those banks and other financial institutions were at risk of falling over? Number two, how did you ensure that financial institutions which did not come or were not domiciled in the major economies still had access to international lines of credit to keep the arteries of the global economy still functioning? And thirdly, how did you prevent this crisis in finance from turning into a fundamental crisis in the real economy in terms of its effect on pushing companies over and people losing their jobs and mass unemployment then ensuing? All this really occurred or came to a crunch in the month of October 2008. At that time, I had been elected for about 9 months. I thought we were in smooth economic times. That's what the briefing notes said from my Treasury when I assumed office. It was not like that. And my counterparts in each of the other major economies of the world was similarly caught, I think, by collective surprise. And so very rapidly we had to decide whether we were going to act independently or whether we were going to act collectively. At that stage, the only institution which existed at a global scale which could operate globally was the G8. At that stage made up of the United States, Japan, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Canada, Italy, and in those days the Russian Federation. It represented about 50% of global GDP, about 10% of the world's population. And as an institution, it had come into being way back in the 1970s after the first oil shock hit. But when President Bush at the time looked around and said, given the nature of the emerging crisis, does the G8 have the capacity or the legitimacy to deal effectively with the dimensions of the unfolding crisis, which were hitting all major global economies simultaneously? The answer, of course, was no. To give President Bush his due, he decided that we needed rapidly to convene another more representative international gathering at head of government level, namely the G20. The G20 by that stage had existed only as an instrument of finance ministers and had come into being as a result of the Asian financial crisis, which hit way back in 1998. And the lessons learned exercise from the Asian financial crisis a decade before, finance ministers from these 20 economies got together and decided on an annual basis the need to exchange notes on what to do about stability in the Asian financial system, given the rising significance of Asian financial institutions, so that we would not be caught unawares again. So at least this institution existed at finance ministers' level. What President Bush did was say quite rapidly that we needed to convene this at head of government level, given the multidimensional nature of the challenge we faced. And so we met in Washington. I remember it well. It was cold as hell. Well, hell's not really cold, I suppose, but it was exceptionally cold. And I have never seen a look of such collective concern as I saw on the faces of the assembled gathering of heads of government that night over dinner in the White House as we all contemplated the future of the global economy. You see what had happened already in terms of the impact on financial markets and the impact on stock markets and the early impact on the contraction of trade was that we're looking at a worse set of figures than presented themselves to the global economy way back in 1929 and the Great Depression. And so our existential fear was looking at the early indicators, were we about to head over the abyss? And if that's where we were headed, what could we do to prevent that at 5 minutes to midnight? These were focusing times for those engaged in the business of public financial and economic administration. The important decisions taken by that group over the ensuing 12 months, in fact, the most critical set of meetings occurred less than 6 months later at the next G20 summit, which was held here in the United Kingdom, in London, in March-April of 2009, was that 3 sets of decisions were made. One, that we would act collectively as the G20 economies, representing 85% of global GDP, representing 85% of global trade, and representing about 70% of the world's population, that we would coordinate our fiscal stimulus worldwide, that we would coordinate our monetary policy action worldwide, and that in addition to that, we would begin a regulatory reform program around private financial institutions to ensure that markets would have confidence that a new set of prudential standards was being established for those institutions, which would reduce the likelihood of any of them falling over again. And the result was, if you look at the economic data and you look at the indicators for that period of March-April 2009, suddenly all the indicators were heading rapidly south on every conceivable economic and financial measure, and then they bounced. They came back. The road to recovery took the subsequent 2 to 3 years, or frankly, if you look at the state of a number of financial institutions around the world, principally in Europe, it took much longer than that. In fact, there are still a number of economies today, 10 years on, which are not larger than they were in real terms back in 2008. But the critical message was we averted a collapse. And it was a signal exercise in collective global leadership, first by the United States, but then through then Prime Minister Gordon Brown of the United Kingdom, that we were able to do that. And so when we reflect on the G20 10 years on, and as we move up to the 10th G20 meeting, which will occur at summit level in Buenos Aires in Argentina in November, December this year, there will be a lot of debate about what has the G20 got right and what has it had not got right in the intervening decade. On the what it got right front, I would simply make 2 or 3 points to you all. The first is this, that in those unusual events in global economic history, learning the lessons of the Great Depression and learning the lessons of John Maynard Keynes's work in 1936 on the general theory, that when you have a massive contraction of total demand in an economy, it becomes imperative for the state to organise a large level of pump priming into the general economy in order to sustain aggregate final demand, so that you don't have a complete collapse in consumption and you don't have therefore a complete collapse in the economy as a whole. These things should only occur rarely in economic history. But the seminal lesson was that if you act and act decisively and act collectively, you can plug that demand. And we did. One of the principal contributors to that was China through its own massive stimulus program at the time. In fact, had China not stimulated its economy to the extent that it did in 2009 and 2010, where in the midst of a global recession, the Chinese economy was growing at 9.6% on the previous year, then we would have entered into a much deeper and darker global recession than in fact we did. So thank you to our Chinese friends. It was a decisive piece of public policy action. The second enduring lesson was the importance of ensuring that the other great tool of macroeconomic management, monetary policy, was simultaneously deployed by the major economies around the world. I remember at the time, Australia, which in global standards comes in usually at economy number 10, 11 or 12, depending on how it's calculated in a given year. We led the way with a 350 basis point reduction in rates overnight, and then you found each of the major central banks around the world largely following suit, so that real interest rates across most of these economies were reduced to practically zero, and for quite a long period of time. So in other words, using fiscal resources to add to aggregate final demand, and secondly, to use monetary policy to boost demand as well by making the cost of capital negligible for private firms to continue to borrow and to continue to be able to operate. But thirdly, and another success of the G20 was in fact a much longer term process of financial market re-regulation. And this was done through a range of measures. One of the problems with some of the financial institutions which fell over during the global financial crisis of 2008-9 was that their capital adequacy ratios, that is the actual cash they retained within their financial institutions against their overall operations, was too low. And we resolved as an international community that this had to be radically adjusted so they had sufficient self-insurance for the future to be able to survive crises with greater robustness than had been proven to be the case with the first one. Furthermore, we had to deal with what is called in the business the moral hazard of what is also called institutions which are, quote, too big to fail. That is, if one of them fell, then the systemic impact on the rest of the system would be too great. However, if they know that in their private institutions, then their ability to take the measures necessary to make themselves sufficiently robust so as not to fail is qualified if they know at the back of their head the state's going to intervene to rescue them at 1 minute to midnight. Third thing we had to do was to analyse which financial institutions around the world were globally significant enough that if any one of them fell, the roll-on effects would be great across the entire global financial system. And on top of that, again, we ensured that we would set up a mechanism through the IMF to stress test each one of these 100 plus globally significant financial institutions so that if a repeat crisis came, they would in fact have the capacity within themselves to withstand the crisis. And finally, we brought in, perhaps with much less success, new guidelines on global remuneration levels and systems of remuneration for financial institutions' chief executives so that their future rewards were going to be tailored to not just the growth of their institutions, but also the financial health of their institutions. In other words, you wanted a reward structure which wasn't simply going to be geared to growth irrespective of whether that growth was heavily debt-driven, but in fact was driven that their reward structure, their financial remuneration structure, will be driven by a range of other measures, including the ability of their institutions to be resilient against future financial risk and failure. So, those set of reforms were given by us to an institution called the Financial Stability Board, the FSB. It had existed in a different form for some time prior to that, but a major global institutional reform was when the G20 said, okay, FSB, based in Switzerland, you, the FSB, are now going to work directly with the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, in Switzerland, and you're going to work directly now with the G20 itself through our finance ministers to give effect to each of these regulatory directions which we are providing you as heads of government of the G20 countries. So the machinery through which this has been done over a long period of time has been the FSB. Financial Stability Board, which is a mirror institution of the G20, made up of the same economies, but comprised of the heads of the central banks, that is the Reserve Banks, or in here the Bank of England. Secondly, the heads of the central financial authorities of the states concerned. In our case, the Treasury, here the Exchequer, the United States, the Treasury as well. So that together these would have responsibility for ensuring that these reforms, that these regulations would be brought into effect. And beyond that, again, translated back into the national laws of each of the 20 countries concerned. Now, that is a process, let me tell you. In the United States at present, we have a danger. And that is that all this regulation of the US financial sector is contained in a piece of legislation called Dodd-Frank. There are enormous pressures in the United States and the Trump administration to undo Dodd-Frank because it's seen as a piece of perverse socialist European-led legislation designed to destroy the American capitalist system. All that is crap. But that's what's being said in the United States. I now live in New York. I run a think tank there. Here is the problem. If that is allowed to happen, the roll-on impact of this major repudiation of the post-2008 reforms in the financial sector will then have roll-on effects to the rest of the G20, as everyone else then has a race to the regulatory bottom and leaves us back in a situation that we escaped from back in 2008, and we unlearn the lessons of history. So you, as the only American in the audience, you have a massive corporate responsibility on behalf of everyone else in this room to prevent that from happening, if that's okay with you. One final point about the legacy of the G20 is that the solemn resolve of heads of government from the time of the Washington summit in 2008 to the present has not been to resort to wholesale protectionist measures. And by and large, until the election of the Trump administration, that has held. The seminal lesson from the Great Depression of 1929 to 1932 was that when the financial crisis hit, it turbocharged into an economic crisis because the decision taken by the economies of the time was that the best way to protect yourself was to whack up a protectionist wall against everybody else, protect your local industry, throttle the arteries of trade, and as a consequence, somehow, in the imagination of the time, preserve your domestic industrial base. Well, that failed and failed and failed. And the result was that crisis of 3 years became a decade-long crisis. You ended up with 35% aggregate unemployment in most of the advanced economies of the time, which gave rise to the political extremism of the mid to late 30s, which in turn gave rise to fascism, which in turn gave rise to the Second World War. This was not a happy set of circumstances. So the resolve of this group meeting in Washington and London back in 2008-9 was that let us not repeat that mistake again as well. And so in communique after communique in each meeting of the G20 over the subsequent 10 years is a firm collective resolve monitored by the World Trade Organization that each of the member states not resort to either tariff measures or non-tariff measures to protect their domestic economies. I hate to be able to tell you this, but some folks have cheated on the way through. But the cheating has by and large been at the margins. Now, back to you. The United States of America, at least since President Trump has been elected, has now basically said the days of free trade are over. We're back to not just fair trade, we're back to fair trade for the United States. And so therefore we have actions announced against China, actions announced against the Europeans, actions announced against the Mexicans, the Canadians, and everybody else who moves in order to repair the US global trade imbalance. The problem with that is that if the threats by the Trump administration are translated into material action, many of us are concerned we end up in the same downward spiral that we've seen earlier periods of economic history. We are out of recession now, growth is looking good, and there is a greater degree of confidence that therefore a trade war will not generate the sort of aggregate economic consequences we saw back in the 30s. But it will certainly have a deleterious effect on overall economic growth rates. And so it's imperative that trade diplomacy is brought to the fore between the Americans and the Chinese and the Europeans in particular in the weeks which lie ahead, and the Chinese delegation is in Washington as we speak, to prevent that from occurring. The final lesson from the G20 is this. When the G20 was formalised as the premier institution of global economic governance at the Pittsburgh Summit in the United States in September of 2009, we adopted a mandate and a mission to bring about long-term, stable, balanced, sustainable economic growth. Now, that sounds like a nice phrase. What's it actually mean? Long-term sustainable growth meant that we needed to begin as a global economy to identify the future drivers of global growth, such as the digital economy, such as digital finance, such as digital commerce, such as economic infrastructure, such as clean energy, in order to create the new productive drivers of growth rather than having growth dependent purely on one set of financial bubbles or another. That was sustainable growth. Balanced growth meant this: using the period of economic recovery once we'd got through the crisis of 2008-09 to then repair our collective fiscal balance sheets so that the budgetary circumstances of each of the G20 economies was returned to health and stability as well, so that we would not face an overall collective public debt trap for the combined global economies. On this one, the global economy has done much less well. Very few of the G20 economies have returned to budget surplus over the last decade. Some have, narrowly, but most remain in debt. And if you look therefore at the average net debt to GDP ratio of most G20 economies, they are all in collective negative territory, bar one or two, and they are in much worse shape than they were in the events of 10 years ago. This presents a systemic macroeconomic problem for the future. And in that area, the G20 needs to lift its game. Let me conclude with one further observation. The G20, therefore, has, I think, a reasonable track record of success. Those of us who were party to its establishment, rapidly and in crisis circumstances, I think can feel justifiably proud that we avoided a crisis turning into a deep depression, because the economic indicators at the time suggested that was a high probability. We saved the bulk of financial institutions. Very few people lost their savings deposits. There wasn't an outbreak of protectionism, and the global economy within 2 years had returned to positive growth, though the long-term lagging effect in terms of those who did lose their jobs has been significant in many economies, particularly in Southern Europe. But still there remains this unresolved question of long-term balanced growth, a return to fiscal surplus, and on top of that, a better balance between the surplus economies of the world, principally Germany and China, against the trade deficit countries across the world, namely the rest of the world. But there's one final area where we need to pay attention as well, and that's as follows. When we look at the future, we now need to ask ourselves once again the question 10 years on, if there was a repeat crisis, what would be our ability to manage such a crisis in the future? We've reduced the risk of it through the measures that we've taken on individual financial institutions. But what if there was a repeat of the sovereign debt crisis that we've seen in the past as well? What if there was a repeat of the Asian financial crisis, which affected the sovereigns, that is, the sovereign countries of Indonesia, of Malaysia, of the Republic of Korea? What about the Latin American debt crisis, which affected Brazil and Argentina and Mexico? And the Russian sovereign crisis, which occurred over the last 20 years as well. There is a question which is alive in a good piece of academic work done by an Australian colleague called Adam Triggs. You can see the paper online, it's at Brookings, on what is our capacity today to deal with a major crisis in one or a number of public financial systems or balance of payments crises in major economies around the world today. In other words, how strong or adequate is our global financial safety net to deal with such a crisis? He does some analysis and looks at all the tools available for us. The International Monetary Fund, the regional monetary stabilisation agreements, one of which is in Europe, the European Stability Fund, the Chiang Mai Initiative in Asia, established by China and Japan, bilateral currency swaps, together with national reserves. Aggregate those, they come to a number of about $4.3 trillion. If you look at the amount, however, within that which could be deployed in the face of an immediate crisis, it comes down to about $2.5 trillion. And then the question arises that if you had a major balance of payments crisis in one or a number of these major economies in the world, is that sufficient? His technical conclusion is no. And this brings us back to the question of what do we do to again make sure that we've got the best preparatory measures in place to deal with a repeat of such a crisis in the future. And this brings us back to the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund was established for these purposes as part of the Bretton Woods institutions of 1944. But its combined capacity today, even though one of the other things we did as a G20 was to treble its financial resources to deal with sovereign crises in the future, is still well short of a major crisis in the future affecting a sovereign government and a sovereign state. So therefore, for the future of the International Monetary Fund, we need a further reform of its governance, a further reform of its quota allocations to increase again China's quota, given the relative size of the Chinese economy as a share of global gross domestic production, so that the resources necessary for the IMF to do its job in the future against the risk of a balance of payments crisis in a major economy is manageable. We need to see that quota reform happen as well. That debate's about to start next year. It's the 10-yearly review of IMF quotas. And quota means I as an economy represent X% of the global economy. I therefore should have X% of the shareholdings of the International Monetary Fund and contribute X% therefore of the available financial capital to that institution to guard against a collective risk for all of us for the future. That must occur, in my argument, and based on Adam Triggs's paper, as a matter of some urgency, because that, together with the reforms we put in to guard against collapse of future private financial institutions, together with the measures of an extraordinary nature we took a decade ago, would represent the collective armoury we need to guard against a major systemic financial and economic crisis for the future. To conclude, it will hang on America again. No pressure, you've got to keep free trade, you've got to prevent him from killing Dodd-Frank, and convince the United States Congress to allow yet another set of reforms to the IMF's governance for the changes to occur that we need in order for sufficient financial capital to be made available to the IMF to provide these guarantees for the future. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's what the G20's been up to. That's where it's succeeded. That's also where it's fallen short of the mark. And the one I've just talked about, the global financial safety net, is a big challenge for the future, starting next year. Your generation will be responsible for making sure that all those decisions in the future are taken in the right way, not the wrong way. Thanks for your attention.